we're very excited as Unit 19 at the Graduate School of Architecture to be welcoming Dr. Geri Augusto from Brown University. She'll be discussing with us the cosmological concept of Kalunga, which is some beautiful work that she's also done with her son. And so she'll be engaging us on those concepts in relation to the design and the search process. We look really, really forward to hearing this talk, and we also want to welcome IPATC students, and we also want to welcome Dikenga fellows. It's really great to have you here. And my students, and James. So when you're ready, you can get started. Thank you so much, Geri.
I love that short introduction. That's what I told her. I don't need the politician's introduction where you go on and on. Nowadays, you can Google anybody you want anyway, so if you need all those details, you can find them. I'll do my formal beginning, which is, because I practice this, Sanibonani, Dubera, Goeiemorgen, depending on who's here, Bon dia, good morning. And the rest I learned also many years ago in South Africa, and I love it. All protocol observed. But I do want to give thanks to Lisa Cindy, to Melissa Ziba, to these pronunciations, Hoshi, the young technician who was here and gone, but who set us up, and to students of Unit 19, and if there happen to be any from Unit 14, and you'll know why I speak to both. And to Professor Zondi, who is not here, but is the director of IPATC, who has made it possible for myself and my two Litsima fellows, the two profs here in the front, to be here, which then makes it possible for us to have something that is the objective of IPATC, which is Pan-African conversation. In other words, it's an attempt not to be in your disciplinary silos or the campus you belong to, but to try to have crosstalk. I can tell, see, I'm going to need the tea. So the talk today is geared primarily to students of architecture and design, but I'm hoping that students of other disciplines, parts of the campus, etc., can draw something from it and then participate when there's discussion. I think we'll have enough time for discussion. So this is Kalunga. Thinking, Designing, and Research with Black Immaterials. The picture shown here, which I can discuss later, this is going to get out together. The picture here is part of a garden that I designed, and a symbolic garden honoring enslaved people's knowledge at the university where I teach. So we have something called a Center for Study of Slavery and Justice, and I designed a garden for them outside. But this is also Kalunga, and I will explain to you what Kalunga is. We'll come back to it. The conditions, and this comes from a quote from a group called Women in Design. The conditions in which we learn become the conditions we practice and reproduce. I'll repeat that. The conditions in which we learn become the conditions we practice and reproduce. I hope that today's conversation will push us further to think about the conditions in which we learn, who and what is missing from that knowledge landscape, especially in the arts, architecture and design, and in new and emerging technologies, so the digitally related technologies. Recognizing, as Ramon Tejeda puts it in a very interesting volume called Decolonizing Design Reader, what has been ignored and not valued in terms of narratives, viewpoints, perspectives, stories, geographical references, theories, ideas, lineages. I don't want us to think just in terms of symbols to be clicked and dragged, though obviously symbols are the manifestation of many things. I want us to think about what Tasioma Tome calls the design of possibilities, and about cosmologies, as Felmi Sarr puts it, for reading the real, and as metaphors for possible futures. I want us to think about alternatives to linear time and one-way direction. I want us to think about architectural landscape imaginaries. I want us to think about what has been called in a recent design conference at Harvard on Black matter, Black spatial practices and experiences that operate just below the surface of design discourse. I want us to think about how we might present research more creatively. I want us to think about the intellectual heritage in an African language, an African concept, a different vocabulary. So I'm going to give a little bit of a background to the notion or the concept of Kalunga and to the conversation, why it's led me to this conversation. So the first is, you may have noticed here on the slide, it says Geri Augusto and Geri Augusto. Not my husband, my son, one of them. So he is a computer engineer, software engineer, among other things. And I am something totally opposite. I had 3 sons, all of whom became computer designers, engineers, very technical. I am the opposite. I am a technophile who is a technophobe. So I love it, but I'm usually lost in that world. And so it has made over the years very interesting conversation between him and me. You might want to think of this as a research practice because you've got a grandmother, you've got an aunt, you've got a father, you've got an elderly neighbor. So this, what I'm going to present today is based on a book chapter with a similar title, Kalunga, Designing with Black Immaterials. I belong to a collective called the Global Cosmologies and Epistemologies Initiative, which comes out of MIT, but it's a group of, so Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which comes out of a group of us, Brown, where I teach, Harvard, and MIT, professors, interdisciplinary group of professors, but we've designed a graduate seminar precisely for students like some of you, architecture, art, design, computer engineering, which looks at how we might find references from other cosmologies and epistemologies besides the British, the French, the Portuguese, United States, Canada, or otherwise the global north. And what would it mean to do that kind of work, architecture, engineering, digital design, with drawing on those other histories, those other narratives, those other knowledges. I'm also inspired in figuring out what to say today by 2 phrases that I learned about from Teresa that are part of your architectural teaching. So Unit 19 and Unit 14 specifically. The question of ground conditions and the question of, landscapes of memory. And also I'm inspired by the Letsema breakfast table, which is not an actual place, although it is a breakfast table, but it's where my colleagues and I over the last month have had many a discussion where we each chime in our own ways. And it's kind of a model, I think, for academic collaboration because we all come from different disciplines, different areas. And so these are also 2 things that recently inspired when I was trying to think, how do I bring the chapter, which will come out in the book next year, to life? I want us to think about African and African diasporic concepts. And by diaspora, you'll see that I don't just mean United States and Jamaica. I mean the actual African diaspora, which is all the way from Canada to Tierra del Fuego, which is the last point on the South American continent. So I want to think about these concepts as intellectual, creative, and practice resources. I want to think about redirecting design and architecture ontologies. I want to think about narratives and design generators for new future making and for living in difference. I'm thinking that this is a conversation that we start today, but that it can go on among you without me and with me via electronic means. And I'm hoping that you'll join in. Also by means of conversations you're having with your own elders across the disciplinary silos on campus. This is a big campus with parks everywhere. So I want to encourage you to think about crossing over to some other part of the campus, say to where IPATC is or to where design is, to have these kinds of conversations. Think about crossing those disciplinary silos. Policy studies might cross with architecture. Why not? Music might cross with photography. Why not? And across different social worlds and worlds of practice, through, I think what we learn is different ways of paying attention. It's always more useful if you can put together different ways of paying attention. I think of it as something I call cross-knowledges. We do that many mornings, as I said, at the breakfast table. And I think that the GSA students might be doing that if what I saw at the external review is any sign. I think the external reviews are still going on, but I spent the whole day in a very cold building and then in a less cold building watching some very exciting presentations. And that too has inspired how I'm tilting the talk. I know that you and some of your professors are already doing that kind of cross-knowledge conversation because I went to the external review. So I saw there, and forgive my mispronunciation of anybody's name, Sipokazi, who's working on homestead spatial relations in a very interesting way. Mutaleni is thinking about the body as landscape in a very interesting way. Marilise is working through living where one is not supposed to, in this case, Langa Township, and the architecture of carceral regimes. Francois is struggling to figure out how to redo Joubert Park with the interaction of migrant communities. There's Francois with the, I forget this lady's name, but the one who has the doll factory to sabotage history. She's a young woman, I think, from Cape Town. There she is. Okay. What is your name? Why did I not remember? Yes. Very interesting project as well. Masejo's thoughts about the soundscapes of Dimbaza. So if you're in the class with her, you know Dimbaza. And the overlapping dead that are there. And cleansing a space, what would it mean? Sifle, the architecture of protest in Durban, and a lexicon and architectures that might grow out of thinking about memories and practice in motion. To me, it seemed like he was kind of dying, trying to architect or think about an anti-city. Durban is a city now, but if it were an anti-city that served all the residents of Durban in a different kind of way. Other important Global South concepts are scattered throughout the book chapter. So I may mention them in passing or I may not mention them in the images that I show. One important one comes from an Anishinaabe, and Anishinaabe is a Native American group or nation, actually, in the Western United States. So there's a scholar who's Anishinaabe who works with indigenous cosmologies. Her name is Vanessa Watts. And she works with this question of place, thought, the relationship between place and thought. Or the notion of parataxis, which means arranging thoughts and ideas side by side. That's not the same thing as comparison. That's putting them there side by side to see what can happen. And that comes out of work by a Cuban, an Afro-Cuban diasporic scholar of religion and art whose name is Ochoa. And finally, there's something from Mayan cosmolectics from the philosopher Gloria Chacon. If you can get anything by her, you should read it. And she writes on multi-directionality and the double gaze. And of course, we're thinking alongside South African activist scholars who are working on decolonial theory. I won't talk much about decolonial theory, but it's kind of a background. So the work that a number of scholars are doing. So what is Kalunga, as I was asked as soon as my friend walked into the room? We're going to do the rest of the thinking in the talk through the images that I'll present about an African and African diasporic cosmology. The whole thing is called dikenga dia Kongo. And I'm actually wearing one because I had it made into jewelry. Depends on how good your eyesight is, but this is also a dikenga. The dikenga could be something as small as a medallion or something done on ivory. It could be as large as the piece that I showed you in the garden, or it can be something even more. But let me begin by explaining. So this is a concept that comes from the old Kongo kingdom, which is not the political borders of today. So it's the most of northern Angola, can go all the way up to Gabon, to parts of what is today the DRC, parts of what is today Congo Brazzaville. So this is not Congo today. I'm not talking about the DRC. I'm talking about the old Congo kingdom. And so this cosmology is the encapsulation of philosophy, ideas, a whole approach to life. The dikenga dia Kongo is this whole thing. And when talking about the direction is always counterclockwise, never this way, always that way. Kalunga is this part. So there is a cross that the Portuguese, when they started having relations with the Kongo kingdom, thought, oh, they're Christian already, which is not true. This cross is called a Yowa. It's a very, very old Kongo cross. You can see it on cave drawings in the Kongo. Cave drawings from prior centuries, really, really, really long ago. So it's called Yowa. The part that goes through the center here, this line, is Kalunga. So that is Kalunga that I'll be referring to. I want to connect Kalunga ideas and practices which draw on it as a concept in this talk. From artistic and literary production, a kind of Afro-topos, which is not entirely unproblematic, that comes via maroon ecologies. I'm hoping everybody knows what maroons are in the Americas. You actually have them in Cape Town too. Wherever there is slavery, there has been maroon settlements, or at least an attempt. Maroons are those who flee, quit, leave slavery, and go somewhere else to build a community or a habitation, at least in freedom. It can be very close to where they were captive, or it can be far away in the mountains and swamps and forests. And although people connect maroons with the Americas, there have actually been maroons inside African countries, in Senegal, for example. Wherever there is slavery, there have been maroons. Okay? So this is a maroon ecology is also something that the one that I'll talk about draws on Kalunga. And finally, I'll end up with a bit of that long-running mother and son conversation. If I have time, I'll actually read from the conversation, from the chapter. And it's about some of the design challenges with respect to capoeira. So I will explain in due time what capoeira is, but it comes from Brazil. It's a ritualized martial art, which is also a dance form. So what my son did when he was in engineering school is to design a mobile app. So we'll talk about some of the challenges of taking what is a ritualized dance martial art form with its roots in Angola, but captives were taken from Angola to Brazil, and what it means to try to think about doing something 21st century with these kinds of concepts for design. And then I hope in the Q&A to have real conversation, but I can tell you ahead of time, I usually deflect the questions sent to me back to the audience, back to the participants, so it may be you and your professors or you answering each other. But we want to think together with this African and African diasporic concept of Kalunga, so we can disturb colonial reasoning a little bit and open up productive conversations about what acclaimed British Ghanaian architect David Adjaye calls the inquiry behind why things are made. I want us to engage Kalunga in many ways, stretching and extending the concept across space, time, expressions, and embodied practices. So this is a visualization, but this is just a schematic. It can be, as I said, something small as a piece of jewelry, something huge, the dikenga, the whole dikenga, Kongo. It's in the form of a cross, and it's thought of as a continuing journey through life. So you start here, and there are colors that go with each of these. I think on the poster advertising the seminar, you can see the colors. But starting here is considered birth for all humans. And think of this as genderless. So don't think of this as he and she. It's genderless like many African languages originally are genderless. You have to know the context to know if I'm referring to a man, a woman, or any gender. So this is the point, the starting point, which is birth. And the color for that is black. Continuing through kind of a journey through life, the color here is red. And red is considered the height of a certain conjuncture of a complement of human powers. So it would be physical prowess. It would be your strength. It would be when you're at the peak of life. And so these might be classified as male characteristics, but they're not really. And then you continue on the journey and you come to death, and the color for that is white, as it is in many African cultures when you refer to the ancestors or to death, the color is white. If you are given a proper, respectful burial and send-off and recognition by the people who knew you, you transition to the other world, the world of the ancestors. The color there is yellow. So this dividing line, Kalunga, is thought of as the division between the world of the living and the world of the ancestors or the dead in Kongo cosmology. It's a line that obviously can be penetrated. It depends on what you are doing.
This concept is very old. It's in West Central Africa, mainly Kongo Kingdom, but there's something very similar in more southern parts, so all the way down into Namibia. And what happened to many of the people who were captives and taken for slavery on the other side of the Atlantic to be enslaved is that when they were on those ships and on that water, they thought, my God, I'm on the sea of the dead, which in a certain way, as if you want to think about it, is true. So that's Kalunga. But Kalunga also has other meanings. It's thought of as a source of universal power that made things that happened in the past, make things that happen today, and can make things happen tomorrow. There are similar concepts in many other African cosmologies of this kind of power. It stands also for the process and principle of change. The intersection here between Kalunga and Nkula is thought of as each individual's destiny in life. And a lot of times this is referred to as a crossroads. And the whole notion of the crossroads comes up a lot in Afro-diasporic cultures. So you can think of this as directional, you can think of this as movement, you can think of this as cyclical and circular, a life that continues. After the world of the ancestors, somebody else is always born. And so we come back to it. So, it's very important in Caribbean and in African American. When I say African American, I don't mean just USA, because Afro-Brazilians, Afro-Bolivians, Afro-Ecuadorians, they are also African Americans, Afro-Canadians. So in my talk, when you hear me refer to Afro-Americans, I'm not talking about just the United States. And this thing of Kalunga is very important in a lot of cultures. This is an older use of Kalunga. There's a kind of ideographic writing in parts of Angola, which is called Lusona. Angola and even over to Zambia, it's called Lusona. And also in what is today the DRC, practiced by the Chokwe and Luchazi people. So ideographs, as you probably know, are mnemonic devices as well. They're mnemonic devices to help people remember proverbs and fables and games, riddles and animals, and they are a way of transmitting knowledge. So a lot of times people talk about, well, there's no writing in Africa, everything is just oral. No, there are many of these kind of ideographic traditions of writing. This is a very old one. This is an enlargement of a drawing that was done by an Italian missionary named Cavazzi, and he visited the Kongo Kingdom in the 17th century and was there for some years. And so he left this watercolor-filled album, fortunately for us, where he has all kinds of drawings of things from the Kongo Kingdom and from Matamba and Dongo. So this is an enlargement of a Lusona ideograph, but it's representing Kalunga, as you can see here. Those are older uses. We're going to be talking more about other uses. So I'll start turning to Kalunga in literature. We're starting with an early short story by the poet and medical doctor Augustine Neto, who became the first president of independent Angola. But before he was president, he was in jail a lot. And a lot of the times when he was in jail, he was writing poems and stories. So he wrote this short story called Nausea. That, not the best person for music. This here is a church at the coast of Luanda on the sea. Upstairs is a church. Down below, where you can't see, is the kind of holding pen for captives who are going to be enslaved. So the ship, the little boats come out here on the shore off of Luanda, coast of Angola, and would take people out to the slave ship. But at the top was a Catholic church. And this Catholic church has been there since 1600s. So the Catholic Church and the slave, I guess you could call the barracks or holding beneath it, play out into the short story that Augustine Neto wrote. So this is just an extract. I don't know if anybody reads Portuguese, but the main character is Geri Augusto, Old Joe. And the paragraph about Kalunga is this. Old Joe, he's walking along with a young man on the coast of Luanda. This is in the 20th century. The church has been there since the 16th century. Old Joe was already looking again at the sand and muttering deep inside himself, Mualunga, the sea. So you see the roots of Kalunga. Mualunga, the sea, death. This salt water is doom. The sea goes far away out there, until it touches the sky. It goes all the way to America. Above, blue. Below, deep black. So this too is another meaning for Kalunga. That's the path by which many people, many captives, get to the other side, get to be Afro-Brazilians today, Afro-Americans, as you all would consider USA. They went along that sea that is there. So there's a kind of archaeology of Kalunga hidden in plain sight in the United States. I'll spend less time talking about the USA, but I wanted to hit some of the points. So for example, in some of the archaeological sites that are being done now where there used to be slavery, so primarily in the South, but not totally in the South of the United States. This one was a grave slab in an old cemetery for captives, for enslaved people. And the Kongo cosmogram, a form of it, is found inscribed on the gravestone. In some of the large plantations, they've been digging up under the slave cabins and huts, and they found that the enslaved people would put a dikenga, a whole dikenga, Kongo, in the bottom of holes inside, and they would cover it up with, potatoes or pots or whatever they had. They've also discovered bowls that made by enslaved people, ceramics, if you turn them over on the back, on the underside, you see a dikenga. There was recently an archaeological thing in New England. Yes, Black people were enslaved in the north of the United States. It's just that slavery ended there. And so in the north, it's colder, even colder than I'm finding Johannesburg is giving me this cold. And so the enslaved were kept in the same house, maybe in an attic of the master and the mistress in that household. And they found in excavating some of those that some of the enslaved who were often children, 14, 15, they had inscribed dikengas on the walls. So there's a whole archaeological, what should I call it, not a trend, but a shift in the United States to try to reinterpret some of these artifacts. And they are often with Kalunga, there are bottle trees, medicine bottles, bottle borders in yards and graveyards. And the archaeological studies in the United States and in the West Indies are discovering those. So that's why I say Kalunga, hidden in plain sight. There are many other manifestations of Kalunga in African American culture. For example, some of the oldest churches, they do always in the bush churches, they do a walk counterclockwise. Or if you go to a funeral, you have to go around the casket counterclockwise. So these were hidden ways of manifesting, keeping just the symbol in mind, the symbol of the cosmology and the ideas that go with it. Maybe more interesting for some of you is how the whole trend in literature and music in the United States, in Afrofuturism, which is a whole school of thought that I'm hoping maybe some of you read about or study about, they have taken up this whole notion of the sea and crossing that sea of the dead and what happened to, which was often the case, many enslaved people who were thrown overboard or jumped overboard to commit suicide. Among them, either thrown or jumped, were pregnant women. And so some of the Afrofuturistic work is about reimagining what happened to those babies underwater. So there's a musical group called Drexler, whose music has spawned a whole set of mangas and animes and novels all about Drexler. But the basic line is that these babies were born of their mothers underwater, and they managed to survive, and that they've created an entire civilization under the Atlantic of these babies. So Drexler, you can see. There's the being thrown overboard, pregnant woman. There are lots of stories and work about this, but besides those stories, there are some, and the music, there are particular scholars who are working on the Middle Passage and that Sea of the Dead that I think may be useful for you, and a lot of them are working in the genre of Afrofuturism, but not all. I'm just going to list names. You'll hear them on the video later, so you can know them. But Norbese Phillips, who is Afro-Canadian, has a very long poem called Song, which is about a particular one on slave ships and what happened to the people. The cargo was jettisoned because of some insurance problem or something or other. So this poem is about song, and she's recovering the humanity of these people at the bottom of the sea. There's a Caribbean poet, Derek Walcott, whose 1978 poem makes a very important statement. It's called The Sea is History. There's Christina Sharp's 2016 book, In the Wake on Blackness and Beauty, which again takes up this theme. There's Isaac Julian's 2010 video, The Leopard. I wanted to show part of it today, but I thought it would take too long. There's digital media scholar Latrice Gaskins. She's really a digital humanities scholar. So she's both a technician of the digital, but she also teaches at doctoral level about these things. And she's written also something called the African Cosmogram Matrix in Contemporary Art and Culture. But what I'd like to do today is to expand your notion of America itself and of its Afro-descendants in a way that Afro-Brazilian feminist theorist and organizer, someone else you should know, Lélia Gonzalez did, when she coined the notion of Americanidade or Americanity. And you can ask me a question later in the discussion if you want to know about it. But it was to recognize the multiplicity that's inherent in that hemisphere. So it's not just people from the USA and people from Jamaica. So now let's go to the other side, but we won't be in the United States. We'll be primarily Latin America and Caribbean. So crossing over with enslaved persons from West Central Africa to places such as Colombia and Cuba, Kalunga acquired other diasporic meanings and representations. Here you see, for example, a firma or graphic writing, which is part of Afro-diasporic religions in Cuba. This is the firma for Kalunga, and you can kind of see the adaptation, the transfiguration that takes place. Don't think of these in the way the old anthropological argument was about how many Black people retained retentions when they left. This is not a discussion about retentions from Africa. This is a discussion about taking symbols or ideas that were implanted in one's head when one was an adolescent or young person, arriving on the other side with nothing, no clothing, no property, no implements, but a full head of culture and a full head, in many cases, of skills and technologies that people would have learned before they got herded onto the slave ship. This is not so much about retentions as it is about what I call reconfiguring, translating, and so forth, that these enslaved captives had to do in order to live and have a life on the other side. So one of the things that gets reinterpreted and reconfigured is precisely this Kalunga. So this is a spirit or Mpumu Kalunga, the Afro-Cuban religion, Palo Alto. And this one is probably older even than this. This is Kalunga as a diasporic deity. This is from a place in Colombia called San Basilio de Palenque. Palenque is actually the Spanish term for maroons. So maroon settlements are called palenques. And these people who were captives, who fled from slavery in Colombia, intermingled over centuries with the indigenous people. And so they are really Afro-indigenous in a certain sense, so African descendant mixed with local indigenous people. And they formed a religion. But guess what? Kalunga becomes part of their religion. So this is a two-headed bastion. And I'm told by the scholars that one side represents their African ancestors and the other side represents their Native American ancestors. And they have formed their people, Choco. But this is Kalunga as well. You want to think about these kind of spiritual uses of the concept of Kalunga and what an object that we think of in the museum is called an art object, but they're not necessarily art objects. They have life, they have uses, they are real objects. So we want to connect these kinds of creative and spiritual expression with something that the Nigerian art philosopher Nkiru Zeku calls Ashe aesthetics. Ashe in Yoruba language has some relationship to what Kalunga is about, that power, that energy that can create different things. She asks a question, how does an object function like an intangible, vital energy? She's talking about art that brings about transformation. Material forms, graphics, often sacred, that she says metabolize and excrete and change reality. And also she says this is a way of inhabiting time and space. So for example, dance can have Ashe. Kalunga, sometimes now with a C, so I'm telling you things get transfigured. sometimes with a K, also traveled with enslaved persons from West Central Africa who were pressed into forced labor in Brazilian diamond, gold, and emerald mines in the early 18th century. You see a drawing of these people, primarily from Angola, West Central Africa, also some from Guinea. The Nigerian influx begins a little bit later than this. And so these are enslaved diamond miners. I thought that might resonate in South Africa in a certain kind of way. Diamonds, gold, and then later emeralds. And so this is a novel. These are novels that rose to talk about Kalunga, to talk about these people. Kalunga also becomes at this time in this area, which is the province is called Minas Gerais, General Mines, for the obvious reason, in Brazil. And they create a language that they call the language Kalunga. So it's an Afro-Portuguese Creole in this part of Brazil that is also called Kalunga. And it's spoken around, Minas Gerais, the area where these people were working, by the descendants of slaves taken to that region during colonial time to work in the mines. And the language still survives today, but today it's more kind of like a secret language that people would talk when they don't want what they are saying to be known or understood. Most of the children who go to school are just learning straight Portuguese, Brazilian. But this language still exists. And for working class Black men who live in particular cities, some of them call themselves still Kalungadores. And they would be speaking this language in a kind of way, sort of like a conceptual kind of language that they learn to speak around the mines. Another manifestation of Kalunga. On the right-hand side, in the 19th century, so still 80s, this is a composer, Enrique Guerrero, who was descendant of slaves in Cuba. So in 1818, 1887, so I'd say mid-19th century. This is a piece of music he wrote, and it's called La Kalunga. So you can see all the ways that the meaning of Kalunga is traveling and getting changed. And they say that this piece and his whole style, La Kalunga of writing, is the antecedent to salsa of today. So it leads to another type of Afro-Cuban music and eventually ends up as part of salsa. But as you can see, his inspiration mid-19th century was Kalunga. Another retransfiguration, reappropriation of Kalunga is these dolls. These little dolls here, exquisitely made, are made every year in Recife province in Brazil. The festival is called Maracatu. It's a combination of Carnival, as you may have seen or known it, and particular indigenous peoples' festivals. And every year, people dress up, very elaborate costumes are made, but Kalunga is actually the small doll. So the person who's representing the queen and her attendants, etc., for this annual religious or the quasi-religious parade in the streets is carrying her Kalunga. And they're absolutely beautiful to see them. That too is Kalunga. So you can see all the secondary meanings that Kalunga begins to acquire and how they stretch out to other aspects of life. Kalunga is also about what Afro-Brazilian novelist and literary theorist Conceição Evaristo calls invented time. She is a major writer of novels, poems, and literary theorist. If you know Toni Morrison and all that we think and how we love and how we exalt Toni Morrison, she is Toni Morrison in Brazil. She's also a literary scholar. So I think it was last year, 2 years during COVID lockdown, they had in one of the major museums in Rio de Janeiro an exhibit called Águas de Kalunga, the waters of Kalunga. And so each of several famous artists and actors and poets from Afro-Brazilian community were asked to do a day in which their work helps the exhibit Águas de Kalunga. And she wrote, Conceição Evaristo, this audio poem about Kalunga waters, which guard the dead. A cosmogonic vision that can be found in African cultures brought to all the Americas. And it's just a line from the poem. We respect the waters. We cultivate tears. We are the inheritors of those who know how to pour and dry with our own hands. This is a shot from the museum. This is a different way of thinking about Kalunga. I should stress before I say this that there's a whole burgeoning field with which you may be familiar called Black geographies or maroon geographies. A lot of that work, again, is about the United States. So instead of talking about that, I'm going to talk to you about Brazil. But you should know that in the English-speaking Caribbean in the United States, there are a lot of scholars who are writing about Black geographies. Adam Bledsoe, Tiffany King, Neil Roberts, Catherine McKittrick, and of course the senior scholar Sylvia Winter. All praise is due to them, all of them, but I'm not going to talk about them today. I'm going to talk about a closer, more lived contemporary experience in thinking of Brazilians about these geographies. These are matters of history, not just ethnography. A community in very special circumstances of repression and violence. They're called in Brazil, in Portuguese, quilombos. So quilombo, palenque, maroon, it all means the same thing. Sometimes mocambos. Pictured here are the falls and river, protectively screening the maroon community of, no surprise, Kalunga in the state of Goiás in Brazil. This Kalunga was also founded during slavery times by fugitive enslaved miners. So they connect to the miners in Minas Gerais, and the previous one they run away to the deeper in the interior. And it is said that this is the oldest continuously inhabited quilombo in Brazil. In the land of these Kalunga people, and so they were reimagining. This is the river. The river is also called Kalunga by them. They gave it that name. And then this waterfalls. And they felt that once they were past the river, behind the waterfalls, deep up into the forests and the valleys, the Portuguese could not get them because enslaved people were always pursued when they escaped. But they got behind here in mid-17th century, late 17th century, and have been there ever since. So this is a contemporary maroon community, not something from history long ago. And the interesting ways that this plays out, this plant is also called Kalunga. They gave it the name, Kalunga. And it's also found in other places in Latin America. They call the plant, which has, of course, a Linnaean name, something, something, something in Latin, and the place where it grows near a stream of the same name, Kalunga. It makes the land, or so they believe, where it grows sacred, a land that never dries, good for planting food for all of life. And so this plant here is also. I spend a lot of time working when I'm in Brazil on the part that you can't see, but they're Marelectica, Iemanjá, Conceição, Quilombo. In a contemporary maroon fishing community called Conceição das Salinas, and these are images from there. This young lady here was my master's degree student, is now my doctoral student. She is a fisherwoman, and she's also studying to be an anthropologist. And I could explain later why a fisherwoman would have to become an anthropologist in Brazil who lives in a fishing quilombo. So this is the quilombo. These photos are actually from the period of COVID. I think we had a little side discussion just before class about what happens when the government does or does not respond in a certain way to COVID. What the people in the quilombos in Brazil decided to do is that they would do the provisioning and the care for themselves. So this is a boat in which Leo and her family member, they're taking what they raise, because these fishing people are also farmers. So it's not a closed economy like we taught that they give you farm, you farm, if you fish, you hunt. But no, they do it all. They have a mixed kind of family economy. And so this is them taking fresh provisions by boat to other fishing communities. This is also from a religious ceremony that they do once a year in honor of Iemanjá, who is thought of as a water divinity as well. And they have a Quilombo Conceição as a radio program, Terra Agua, so land, life, water, territory. And this is from her master's thesis about the African diaspora and the whole question of territory and waters. So this, in a sense, is a kind of abolition ecology, them thinking of a different way, drawing on their own traditions, including the tradition of Kalunga. And so I call her writing and her theorizing around it Marelectics. It's a play off of dialectics, the European, Marxist dialectics. Mare in Portuguese means sea or waves, so Marelectics. And she's drawing on, and her community is drawing on ancestral land and indigenous knowledges, but also they're constantly reinventing a complex of knowledges, culture, and earth and water practices. The point that they are trying to make is that you don't have to live under consumerist, capitalist, neoliberal economies, and you can still have a life that draws on your traditions in the 21st century. So it's a 21st century imagining of possibility, which create possibility of creating and appropriating new technologies, but that are not extractive or excessively consumerist capitalism. And so this too is an interpretation of Kalunga. So what if we thought about people who are building a life in natural and built environments as architecting? I don't know if that word exists, but I've made it up in my mind. People can be architecting the community where they live. And if so, when I was thinking about that, I was inspired once again by David J. So in a book of his, I don't have the title here, but he does a book where he looks at African architecture all over the continent, and he takes symbols and buildings and materials and things. How do we reinterpret those 21st century style? And in one of the books, he talks about making for himself something that he calls the material table. It's a riff on the chemical table of elements, if you remember from high school or university. But for him, it is a material table. So he has things like red brick, which he's using for a library building that he's doing here for the Thabo Mbeki Library. Or he's the one who built the Smithsonian's Museum of African American and American History, Culture, and whatever. But it's the most beautiful building nowadays. It's said to be on the mall in Washington, D.C. And he draws entirely on these elements and materials that he finds all over Africa and then reconceptualizes them. So I was thinking, yes, we use materials, but what about immaterials? So Kalunga is an idea. It's not a brick or a piece of wire you can take anywhere. So in my mind, I thought, okay, what about an immaterials table? And that's what this is. It's an idea, it's a set of materials for architecture, for landscape architecture, and other types of design. I've left it open, the numbers are imaginary, but drawn from African, Afro-diasporic especially, and indigenous cosmologies, languages, histories. So for example, I have Ka, Kalunga, immaterial, or bem viver, which I know better in Portuguese, bem viver, or people say living well, which is a whole thing throughout the Americas that people are reworking. What do we want for an economy in a social space? We want people to live well. Or there's an expression in Jamaica called make a life. What am I doing? I'm making a life. So nothing concrete, it's an idea, it's a notion. Or the colors that are used, so the red, the green, the black, or the ones that are in the Kalunga, those too are part of an immaterial that you could use for construction. Or the Orishas, which are the gods, divinities, in the Yoruba religion and in the Afro-diasporic religions that draw. Or ancestors, period. Yes, ancestors are physical, but once they're dead, they're more of an idea of spirit, of presence. Or this one is from a group in South America, so indigenous, Vanta. They have this notion of space and time, but together, not one thing. Space-time is what they call it. Or retrans, which is my way of saying all the things that the Afro-diasporic people had to do. They had to either reconfigure, rework, relate. They had to transport, transfigure. So I call that whole thing retrans. Or water as a metaphor. Or rhythms, or as they say in Jamaica, rhythms. They're not really tangible. You can't build on them, but they can certainly inspire your building, your space, your design, and so forth. Marinetica, of course. I think I said. So now we come to, I don't know how to make this one down, but this is capoeira. So now we get into the long-running conversation between my son and me about something that is a ritualized art form. Some people say, oh, it's a martial art. It's so much more than that. It's dance, it's ritual, and yes, it is also a martial art. Deeply informed by the dikenga de Kongo, and therefore Kalunga figures in it, and the many ideas that are inherent in this form. It's called capoeira. This is a drawing, a painting. When slavery was still You know, Brazil and Cuba were the last places in the Americas to end slavery. So slavery doesn't end in Brazil until 1888. So this is Johan Moritz was probably Dutch, but maybe not, artist who traveled in the 1830s throughout Brazil. And so this is a drawing from the 1830s of two practitioners of capoeira at the time. This is a little bit older one. This was in the early 20th century, but one of the mestres, they call the master who teaches capoeira, the master, the initiated and well-practiced who teaches the others. And this is one of the most famous ones, Mestre Pastinha, in Rio de Janeiro, early 20th century. And this is a film clip that I wanted to show, but I'm not sure if technically I can. But Besouro, which is one of the best-loved films in Brazil, and it gives a kind of history of capoeira as well. Okay. So capoeira has been taken up. It originates in Brazil. If you go to Africa, you will not find it there. But if you go to Angola, you will see the roots of capoeira in certain kind and other places in West Africa. Martial art kind of dances that they do with sticks and so forth and so on. And so the schools are now all over the world. So this one, I can't remember even where the school is, but you can see how they're using Kalunga and working it into how they teach capoeira and also expanding it to teaching about leadership and so forth and so on with the colors and the circle. And there's a move in capoeira called ginga, which is why my son was a sensation when he first went to Brazil. His name is Ginga, which you may know as a queen's name, but like I said, African names are actually genderless. It depends. So Ginga in Angola is a man's name. It was actually the first king that started all the problems because he converted to Catholicism when the Portuguese came. So he was Ginga. My son is Ginga. And then there's Queen Ginga, about whom you might have heard more from Angola. So the move in Kongo and Kimundu Ginga is to do like this, weaving in and out. That's what Ginga means. So they say, one of the masters says, one of the main things you must learn in capoeira is to Ginga on the Kalunga line. So you're on this line and you must learn it's a certain way of weaving and bobbing and dunking. If I could show you the film, you would see. But anyway, in many of those languages in Angola, Kujinga is a tactical mode. It's a way of reassembling the integration of being and knowledge, communication, and another philosophy. It's a body. So my son has written a lot about this. This is where I had him come and explain at a leadership conference. What does it mean to have a different idea about not being in competition, but yet working together where you have to compete? So he wrote this thing, the epistemic roda. Capoeira is always practiced in the circle. Now we come to his project. So when he was a senior or undergraduate for computer engineering, he decided he wanted to make, and this is when phone apps were first coming out, he was going to make an app for capoeira masters, for the masters who teach. And it's a dance, this is the real definition of capoeira, danced, fighting form, and ritualized game. These are images from his iPhone of the capoeira app. So you can see all the things he was trying to do, the movements, the kicks, the takedowns. He was trying to comprise a list of places where there are capoeira competitions and festivals. He did a search. He said it took him months to do this, finding pieces of art that referred to capoeira. And all of this is how he was trying to incorporate it into the app. Here's some more. It's a particular type of drum that's used in capoeira. It's called atabaque. And so he was trying to catch the rhythm. He's explaining what it is. He has a video of how to play it. He's talking about the moves as the moves are signaled. It's the music in capoeira. So the players are in a circle. You have a mestre at the beginning of the circle. And the mestre is the one with the drum or this instrument that comes from Angola called berimbau. And so the movement is actually part of how you play capoeira. So he's trying to figure out, for all of these things, how do I get them on this phone app? Which I can tell you the story in the end, he ended up not doing it. He did it as a university project, but he didn't do it. So what I'd like to do, how am I doing on my time? Somebody was supposed to keep my time.
You have
And she
2
said,
minutes left.
how much time?
2 minutes.
2 minutes?
Well, 7 minutes actually.
Or 7? Okay, I'll take the 7. I'm going to read from the conversation Because in the book chapter that this whole talk is based on, the second part of it is actually just a transcript of our conversation. So my name is Geri, his name is Njinga, and I'll read part. In the conversation below, we delineate some of the dilemmas, difficulties, and joys of creating a computer application that was intended to be a companion for capoeira mestres. We touch on a series of dilemmas encountered in trying to design that app, not only with technical prowess and the usual digital libraries and tools, but also to meet the ethical concerns of mestres. How, for example, could the app designer convey what he calls players, the people who are doing it are called players, intentionality, when the nonstop weaving back and forth, that's Kujinga, the obfuscation and the feints of Jinga must be read while in action. So you're playing and you're trying to read your opponent or co-player, and you're listening to the music because the music is giving signals. How could the designer render in computer code the entire synesthesia of a practice in which music on ritual African-derived instruments is not just background rhythm, but encoded, specialized knowledge, enhancing emotions and pleasure? How might the layered meanings and feelings of playing in a circle or a roda be communicated? How is the cultural essence of the game, its aesthetical ethics, to be conveyed? How might a capoeira mobile digital app convey multidirectionality, or the way some movements reshape time and space? And of course, how should the app convey the ways in which Kalunga is metaphorically embodied in the game? So, Geri. So you first told me about your capoeira app design about 12 years ago when you weren't long out of completing your undergrad computer engineering degree. This is a nice interval for looking back. So one of the things I want to understand from our conversation today is, when you were thinking about capoeira in a digital mode, what did you think about, or how did you think about the intangible things? I'm going to think of this as amplifying practitioners' knowledge. Njinga. I'll just talk about some of the difficulties, Mom, that I've had and what I had to keep in mind when I was designing the app. Because there were other apps already on the market. This was not the first app. It was intended to be the most comprehensive and the one that had probably more of those intangibles in mind in terms of the design, because it was being designed by a practitioner, written by a practitioner, designed by me. Usually the developer has to translate what the practitioner says into code. But if you don't know code and a coder tells you that it can't be done, then what are you going to say? And he laughs. He said, I knew what could be done. So me doing the design and me being a capoeira practitioner was a blessing and a curse. A curse because in my mind I had the vision and I knew exactly how I wanted it to come out. A curse because I'm also a developer and I knew the limitations of the tools. These are trade-offs that you have to make. I knew the limitations might entail a lot and I didn't want to mess up. Someone suggested to me, why don't you just call it the Mestre app? And I'm like, no, there can't be an app that can be a Mestre. The intent of the app is not to teach you capoeira. It was a companion app. In the end, I had a product that was okay, but not exactly what I wanted. And he explains why. This one is, it would seem to me that doing this kind of work requires a way of thinking about language that's very complex. Meta language in song, played and performed. Njinga, and intent also. Geri, what do you mean by that? Njinga, engaged intent. You can sing the same song with the same lyrics, but with different beats. They're called Portuguese tokes. Tokes that are different speeds for different cues. If I sing a song, A Bananeira Caiu, which means the banana tree fell down, in one toke, which could be slower and more measured, it might not have the same meaning as if I played it in the grand toke, which is the aggressive one. You're calling that intent, Geri. You're calling that intent. Yeah, it's the intent of the person who's singing. If the person who's singing is at the same time playing the berimbau, the musical instrument, they're controlling the circle. They're in control of everything, basically. If you change the toke and you change the tone and you play more or less aggressively, then the players know what to do. And all of that is communicated through song. So I don't do too much more time. I'll go to it again. He's talking about the rituals. So one of the important rituals is you touch the ground before you go into the circle. And that is touching Kalunga. You pay respect to the ancestors, sometimes by a flip And sometimes just by touching the ground, and then the two people go into the circle play. And so he has to interpret in the app Kalunga, its meanings, the move, and everything about it. And he's explaining that, and there are other rituals that are done, there are African rituals that are all to the tune of the music. So, Geri, it all seems to suggest a very broad question. What's different about trying to think design, pulling metaphors and concepts from an everyday Afro-diasporic cultural practice like capoeira? One writer called it redirecting design ontologically. I think in part it's the complexity, the tremendous complexity, and the humaneness. Nshinga, yeah, exactly, Mom. Geri. A game which stops because, one player is tired. In capoeira, the master can decide, okay, we're going to stop. They're in the middle of fighting together. They'll give a toke on the drum, and they just have to stop. And when they stop, they do something called giving a circle around the world, counterclockwise, like the dikenga requires. And they walk around until whoever is tired stops being tired. Geri, a game which stops because one player is tired and the other one understands that. That's why I love the Dar Volta ao Mundo part of capoeira. It's beautiful. There's a dance aspect when you watch it, but there's especially a humanness about it because Lord knows that our people do get tired. And so a game that includes the value of the other player being tired. I don't know of other games that do that. I know there's timeout in some sports, Giga. You get penalized if you do a timeout, and you only get a certain amount of them. You don't have infinite timeouts. Geri, we're speculating, but I think that comes out of the everyday life experiences and histories of the people who created capoeira. Giga. For its practitioners, capoeira can be an enterprise opportunity. He recounts a master who started a business on it. It can also be a family, a set of relationships. That's one of the aspects where I think my app failed when I was creating it, and he elaborates on why. But capoeira can also be an escape vehicle or a refuge, like those Maroons did. It can be a physical refuge, a mental refuge, or it just provides joy, pure joy. So, I want to end with some theoretical considerations for design, practice, and research with Black Immaterials. The first thing that I think it could do is to help us rethink space, time, and direction. You think of people going over on a slave ship, but also circulating all over the Americas and also coming back to Africa in some cases or going to live in Europe. And these time things are happening constantly. The space and the time. Kalunga, the dikenga, that idea helps you rethink space and time, to give it a flexibility, to think about it in a dynamic way, to think about overlappings, think about multiplicity. Thinking with Black Immaterials, in my case, this example, Kalunga, also helps us think about water and the relationship between water and land. Thinking across, through, with, under, alongside water. We often think in architecture just about land, but think about water too. The whole notion of mariletica or tidallectics, those people of the waters, which is what some of them in the fishing maroon settlements, quilombola settlements in Brazil, they call themselves o povo das águas, people of the waters. And they are thinking, they are architecting their space and way of life. They're thinking of a relational way of life, of alternative ways of being, about claiming and re-existing, about struggle, about ebbs and flows in life. They think about thinking, territory, culture, and being all together. Quilombola thought, I call it. I think that these concepts, these Black Immaterials, can help us think about complexity, about intention, values, emotions, transformative energy, sound images, and art objects, what Nzebu, following an older Nigerian scholar called Abiodun, calls ashe aesthetics, movement and embodiment, thinking, perceiving, moving bodies. I think it can help us think about creating past, present, future humans, and spaces. Siyabonga.